Welcome to ancient Greece. A bloody battle has just wrapped up between the Spartans and their adversaries, and bodies litter the landscape. Most of the time, enemy corpses would be stripped of their possessions and eventually returned to their friends and family after the Spartans made their foes do a little song and dance. However, as you're about to see, there was also a more sinister side of this post-battle cleanup ritual, one involving humiliation, desecration, and could even incur the wraths of the gods. Come with us as we travel across the battlefields of ancient Greece to uncover what would happen after a fierce Spartan battle. To understand how the Spartans dealt with the dead bodies of their own soldiers and those of their enemies after a fight had concluded, we need to understand who the Spartans were. Most people conjure up images of 300 chiseled, able-bodied warriors defending the hot gates at the Battle of Thermopylae when they think of Spartan warriors. And to be fair, that's not all that far from the truth. Tales of Spartan victories and the fierceness of their warriors spread across ancient Greece like wildfire. And there is no denying that Sparta was one of the region's most powerful and influential city-states. Decades of warfare across Greece inevitably led to battlefields being covered with the remains of slaughtered soldiers. And it's from around this time period that we get accounts of how Sparta dealt with the post-battle cleanup after a bloody fight. So what did the Spartans do with all the dead bodies that they left in their wake? How did they treat the fallen soldiers of their society and those of their enemies? Surprisingly, for being such a brutal warrior culture, the Spartans treated post-battle cleanup in a somewhat compassionate way. However, there was almost always a secondary agenda when Sparta decided what to do with the remains of that littered battlefield. After a Spartan victory, the warriors would take some time to reflect, thank the gods, and pay homage to their dead. When this was happening, slaves and other low-ranking members who accompanied the Spartan army on their campaigns would scour the battlefield for fallen enemy soldiers. They would strip the armor and weapons from the bodies, but would not desecrate the corpses in any way. This was because it was customary to return the dead bodies to their people so that the proper funerary practices could be carried out. Even Sparta, the most militaristic society in Greece, adhered to those principles. After a battle, the Spartans would either leave the enemy bodies where they fell or move them to a protected area, if need be, so they could eventually be returned to their adversaries after a few boxes had been checked off. It was considered undignified and against the will of the gods to let the bodies rot on the battlefield, so post-battle cleanup needed to be done in a timely manner. Most Greeks either buried or cremated their dead in a ceremonial way, depending on their status and culture. It was also believed by the Greeks, including the Spartans, that the dead should be mourned by their community and commemorated, which was another reason that the bodies were not mutilated or disposed of by the Spartans or any Greek force. Even though the Spartans almost always planned to return their bodies of their enemies, they would not abandon the battlefield. This was because there was a second component that was vital to Sparta's post-battle traditions. At the end of an engagement, the winners of the battle would inevitably control the area. This meant that when Sparta defeated an opposing force, they would not only be in control of the land, the resources, and the discarded weapons left behind, but they would also be in possession of their enemies' dead and wounded. Since it was imperative for the dead to be given proper funerary rites, the defeated force would need to send a representative to declare a truce so they could recover their dead soldiers. The truce itself held a lot more significance than just ceasing hostilities between the two sides for a certain amount of time. Rather, this truce would act as an admission of defeat. What this meant was that one of the post-battle customs was to guard the bodies of the enemy until a truce was called, at which point the battlefield could be cleared and the next Spartan engagement could be planned. The returning of the bodies was one of the reasons that right after a battle, Sparta would strip their adversaries' corpses of their weapons and armor. Sparta almost always allowed their enemies to retrieve their dead, but they weren't going to let them reclaim their gear. So once the fighting ceased and Sparta controlled the battlefield, they immediately went about separating fallen enemy soldiers from their wartime garb and then waited for the losing side to send a herald to make a truce, which formally acknowledged Sparta as the victors. A perfect example of this post-battle cleanup routine was written by a Greek military leader, philosopher, and historian by the name of Xenophon, when he recounted the Spartans allowing their adversaries to reclaim their dead after the Battle of Coronea in 394 BCE. Xenophon wrote in Book 4 of the Hellenica. The Thebans, however, sent heralds asking to bury their dead under a truce. In this way, accordingly, the truce was made, and Agesilaus went to Delphi and offered to the god a tithe of the amount derived from his booty, an offering of not less than 100 talents. But Gaius the Polemarch withdrew with the army to Phocis. From there, he made an invasion of Locris. This was by no means the only evidence that Sparta and other Greek polities followed the post-battle procedures discussed thus far. Many of the histories that came out of ancient Greece corroborate the fact that at the end of the battles, a truce was asked for by the defeated, and then the victors allowed them to claim their dead. Therefore, due to the practice of stripping the deceased enemy bodies of their gear and then allowing their adversaries to claim their fallen soldiers, Spartan battlefields tended to be relatively free of human remains soon after the fighting had concluded. This is in stark contrast to the bloodbath that would have occurred during a Spartan engagement, as the battle-hardened and well-trained warriors ripped through anyone who stood in their way. It's worth noting there was at least one occasion where Sparta did not follow the conventional method of post-battle traditions, but this seems to have been exceedingly rare. The Battle of Aegospotami was fought in 405 BCE and would be the final battle between Athens and Sparta during the Peloponnesian War. During the fight, the Spartan naval fleet, under the command of the brilliant military leader Lysander, destroyed the Athenian navy. This, in effect, ended the war, because with their fleet crippled, Athens could no longer import the food and resources necessary to support their empire or their military campaigns. After the Spartan naval victory, Lysander led a series of land campaigns to conquer the territories around Athens. In one battle, the Spartans had clearly won, and approximately 4,000 Athenians had been captured. Lysander gave the order to execute the prisoners and then refused to give the bodies back to the Athenians for proper burial. This decision was probably driven by a combination of the intense hatred the Spartans held for the Athenians, along with Lysander's desire to intimidate and punish Spartans' adversaries into submission. The refusal to allow their enemy to gather their dead from the battlefield was somewhat of an anomaly, as the Spartans almost always permitted their adversaries to clean the battlefield once they had admitted defeat and the gear had been confiscated from the corpses. Interestingly, some armies, including the Spartans, would not ask for a truce in order to reclaim their dead. This was likely because admitting defeat was a fate worse than death for a warrior culture such as Sparta. Instead, Sparta would sometimes insist on fighting another battle for the right to regain possession of the bodies, even if they were severely outnumbered. A whole new battle would erupt at the same location that one had just been fought, solely to recover the bodies of fallen comrades and allies. Some Greek cultures would also use the post-battle cleanup phase to ransom some of the dead bodies. In these situations, the enemy had clearly been defeated and was sometimes even allowed to collect some of their dead on the battlefield. However, the victors occasionally held onto a few remaining corpses to force their enemy into conceding more territory or for payment in resources. It seems likely that this dishonorable act was rarely or never done by the Spartans, but they did secure as many possessions from fallen soldiers as possible, not only for their own use but to shame their enemies as well. For example, at the Battle of Mantinea in 418 BCE, the Spartans were said to have reformed their battle line directly in front of the dead. This was done specifically so the only way Athens and their allies could retrieve their fallen soldiers was to ask for a truce, thus forcing them to admit defeat. At the Battle of Coronea in 394 BCE, Sparta took this tactic a step further when, as they progressed deeper and deeper into the lines of the Thebans and Argivae, they actively pulled the dead bodies behind their lines to ensure the only way their adversaries would get them back was if they admitted defeat. What happened after a battle was over was almost just as important as the battle itself for Sparta and other Greek polities. And this brings us to what the Spartans did with their own fallen warriors after a battle. The post-battle cleanup was not just focused on securing the bodies of their enemies, but also on the necessity of ensuring dead Spartans were given the proper funerary rites. Most of the city-states around Greece would bring their dead home after a battle in order to burn or bury them in their homeland. This could be done by returning the actual body to the family or burning the warrior on a funeral pyre and then bringing the ashes back to their homes. The Spartans were different in this respect, though. After a battle, they would gather their fallen soldiers and construct burial mounds directly on the battlefield itself. Spartans meticulously took the time and effort to construct a final resting place for their brothers in arms, even if it was in a foreign land. To put how militaristic Sparta was into perspective, it's actually rare to find Spartan burials in Laconia, where the city-state was located. This is likely because most of the battles fought by Sparta were outside of their own territory, as they looked to expand their power or come to the aid of allies. In 403 BCE, after securing a victory, the Spartan army created a tomb for their dead soldiers on top of an Athenian public cemetery. It's been suggested that these Spartan burial mounds were constructed as reminders to the other Greek polities that not only would Sparta happily support their allies, but that they were not afraid to send their armies across Greece if need be. The underlying principle for Spartan military tactics was that the best defense is a good offense. The Spartan army could be dispatched to suppress uprisings or to extend Sparta's influence throughout Greece. The funerary mounds served as a constant reminder around the region that the Spartans had been there and that they were not afraid to return in order to protect their homeland and culture. Plutarch wrote an anecdote about this Spartan mentality, which most historians believe likely never occurred, but it still illustrates the Spartan war culture. Plutarch states that a traveler from Argos once said to a Spartan warrior, "There are many Spartans buried in our land." The Spartan replied by saying, "But there are no Argives buried in ours." This was written to depict that Sparta had a presence throughout the region, but their homeland had yet to be conquered. We now know that the post-battle cleanup for the Spartans consisted mainly of securing their own dead to be buried on the battlefield while also claiming anything of value from the corpses of their enemies before allowing them to recover their bodies after they admitted defeat. However, to understand why these practices were so important to the Spartans and other Greek cultures, we need to examine the funerary practices in a little more detail. This will shed more light on the exact reasons why post-battle cleanup was handled the way it was. The ancient Greeks believed that when someone died, the spirit immediately left the body with their last breath. It was a deeply held belief that not properly burying or carrying out funerary rites was an insult to human dignity itself. This meant that even after an intense battle, it was shameful to not eventually let both sides reclaim their fallen soldiers in order to complete the proper funerary rituals of that culture. This was why it was incredibly rare for a post-battle cleanup not to include the securing of dead bodies by both the victors and the defeated. The rituals after death typically consisted of 3 parts. Part 1 was known as the prothesis, which is where the body was laid out, anointed with oil and washed before being dressed. Relatives and friends would then visit the body to mourn and pay their respects. For Spartans, this part of the ceremony was modified, as the deceased would be buried directly on the battlefield. But it's generally agreed that their bodies still went through the prosthesis in preparation for their burial. Part 2 of the ritual was called ekphora, which was basically a funerary procession that took place just before dawn. The ekphora brought the body to its final resting place, where the 3rd step of the funerary process, or interment, would commence. It was rare that many objects would be placed in the grave when someone died, but for the most prestigious Greeks, elaborate tombs were built, or marble stelae, and statues were erected in order to mark where a grave was located. Spartans did this on a smaller scale after a battle and would always leave some kind of marker to commemorate their fallen brothers and to proclaim their exploits. The Greeks believed that immortality was achieved by being remembered, and therefore erecting monuments or inscriptions to commemorate the dead was vital. Graves were visited by people, and gifts such as cakes and libations were left as offerings to honor the dead. Again, this could only happen if bodies were secured after a battle and put through the proper funerary rites. Sparta would have continued fighting battles, securing dead bodies post-battle and erecting burial mounds for their soldiers if they hadn't overextended themselves and eventually run into a force they could not defeat. In 371 BCE, Sparta lost the Battle of Lectura against Thebes. This defeat resulted in Sparta being absorbed into the Achaean League, and the once mighty Sparta became subjugated. Several centuries later, the Roman Empire had grown in size and power, and by 146 BCE, the Romans had invaded Greece and controlled most of the city-states in the region, including Sparta. Sparta had actually allied itself with Rome for a time to gain its independence from the Achaean League, but they only swapped one overlord for another. Eventually, Rome allowed Sparta to once again be an independent city-state, but this freedom meant very little, as Sparta had been occupied by outside powers for so long that they had lost almost everything that had made their militaristic civilization so unique and powerful in the first place. To add insult to injury, in 267 CE, the Goths raided Greece from the north and sacked Sparta. Unlike in the battles of the past, the Goths had no intention of letting the Spartans or any Greeks carry out their traditional post-battle funerary rites, which meant that the post-battle cleanup of ancient Greece and Sparta would remain a thing of the past. Now watch The Real Story of 300, Battle of Thermopylae, or check out The Greatest Last Stands in History.